to all of you. Some of you are also in the Tuesday night class Thursday night class that I've been doing with Exploring Buddhism. But today's topic, I'm going to work with a few of the ideas that have come up in that course around mind training and working with our minds, because of course that's the gist of all the Buddha's teachings. But to get started today, I think it's best for us just to spend a little bit of time in silence. We won't do a real formal meditation, since I think you all did a meditation just previous to this class. So let's just take a moment just to, if you want to close your eyes or at least lower your eyes somewhat, and just begin to settle into being here, being present with each other. This is one of the key things we're going to talk about today in terms of community, how we support each other in our practice. And although we're not all together, we can feel that support, kind of being with each other, even in this virtual environment. And maybe take a few deep breaths, and just kind of on the inhalation, sort of bring in clarity, focus, whatever it is that you feel you need right now. And on the exhalation, just get rid of whatever tiredness or negativity or whatever it is that you feel that you'd like to let go of. So just spend the next minute or two just doing that, breathing in the qualities that you need, breathing out everything that you want to be free of at this time. Then before we begin, we're just going to do a very brief investigation into our own experience with community. And we have a community here of Thupten Kungaling, the practitioners, all of you are part of that. We also have other levels of community in which we're involved. Families, friends, workplaces, as well as the towns, the cities in which we live, various other people that we feel that we're in community with. And what I'd like you to do is just to investigate first those times when you felt that community was really beneficial and that you were a part of that community. When you felt that there was a nice flow going on, maybe stop and think about what were the sorts of qualities that you yourself or others brought to that experience that made it so enriching, made it so valuable. And just take a moment to reflect on that. And then we should also take a moment to investigate the times when community hasn't worked so well for us, where we felt some tension, some conflict within the community. And here too, just spend a moment to see if you can investigate and identify what were the mindsets, the things that you yourself were involved in, or perhaps others that you were interacting with, if you can identify what was going on for them. Just try to be clear about what were the negative tendencies that caused that disharmony, that caused us to not have such a good experience with community. And then to conclude this reflection, to generate a good motivation for being here, to want to investigate this concept of harmony in the community. How do we become a greater source of that for others? How do we address when things are askew, when things become problematic? And really want to do this because we see that when we and others are in harmony, there's greater happiness, greater peace, less suffering. This is always the goal, to try to achieve the greatest welfare for both ourselves and for all beings, and generate that motivation for being here today. And you can fully open your eyes. We're just going to begin with one short prayer. I'm just going to, most of you know this prayer, prayer of refuge and Bodhichitta. We just meditated on some of the concepts behind Bodhichitta. Let's go ahead and recite this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sonam gi dola penshir sangye drupar sho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penshir sangye drupar sho. Okay, again, wonderful to be here with you today, talking about this topic, which I actually think is very timely. In the last 2 years or so, we've been mostly isolated from at least physical community. We all have a virtual community that has kept going for pretty much all the centers in the FPMT. And we also, of course, have our own communities. As I said, we're not going to just focus simply on a Dharma community, though that will be the main focus, but we'll also look at how community plays out in other avenues in our lives. But for many of us, we've had sort of an exclusion from community to some degree. We've been in at least a much smaller, tighter community of people. It's opening up now, has been for the last few months. And as we go back into being with others, no doubt we've brought some of the tendencies that we had when we were more isolated back into community. So we always have to do a sort of checkup to see how do we go about this process of really benefiting community and benefiting from being in community. So what I'd like to do, I've got a little slide presentation prepared, a few quotes in there, as well as just an outline of what I'm trying to cover today. This is, again, a topic that I think is really important for us to address because it's at the heart of so much of our Buddhist practice. So I'm going to start with a few quotes. There's a wonderful little book I picked up when I was at Kopan, actually, leading the November course in 2015, called Living in Harmony by Lama Lundrup. Maybe some of you even met Lama Lundrup, passed away a number of years ago. He was one of the main teachers there at Kopan. He says, as a human being, it is our responsibility to create the causes for harmony. We should engage in whatever means possible to bring about a peaceful environment where we live. And of course, that where we live can be, as I said, a number of different circles, where we work with others in our workplace, where we interact with others socially, where we practice Dharma together, what have you, even our families that we actually physically live with. We have to use this human quality to help ourselves to live in harmony where we are living, and also to bring harmony to where others live. I believe, oh, I'm sorry, that was what quotes, that finishes the quotes from Lama Lundrup. This is actually from an article. I might share a little bit of the article later that you could find on the FPMT's website from Mandala magazine. They asked various teachers to contribute to this idea of harmony in the FPMT. And Geshe Sherab, who many of you know, he's the resident teacher here at Tupten Norbuling in Santa Fe. He says, I believe that harmony is the key for happiness, as it is said in the Vinaya by the Buddha. Harmony in the Sangha is happiness. The practice of harmony is the happiness. So we see that, our practice of harmony actually leads to our own well-being and happiness and is really key. We're going to talk about the Vinaya and this concept of the Sangha shortly, but I like that quote. And then, of course, a wonderful quote from Lama Zopa, and then we'll get into the material more. Lama Zopa, of course, the head of spiritual director of the FPMT, he says the most important thing is harmony, unity in the organization. That is what has brought success so far, unity. It is particularly due to the harmony, the unity, that there has been success and that we have been able to offer this much service. Of course, this is something that our spiritual leaders, His Holiness Lama Zopa Rinpoche, all the teachers that we have point to the fact that harmony in our Dharma communities in particular is really vital. And of course, if we look at what we're trying to practice as Buddhist practitioners, we see that this is completely in line with our practice. Our practice is to, as was said, create the causes of happiness and to free others from suffering. Well, the more that we contribute to the harmony within a community, the more that we uphold that and try to embrace that as one of our main goals, the greater happiness and well-being that there is. I mean, so many of our centers, I have to admit, in my time traveling around in the FPMT, I haven't done that much travel, haven't been to that many centers outside of the US, but I've been to most of them in North America. And I'm always impressed at when I come into a community, how much I already feel a sense of harmony. And when there are times when things are a little disjointed, you can sense that to some degree. And I think it has an effect on those who enter into our spaces, those who look to our centers as a place of refuge, a place of safety and security. So I think this is an important thing, again, as I said, to examine and to figure out ways that we can make sure we don't kind of let that fall away at any times. We try to do whatever we can to uphold it. Not that we're going to have perfect harmony all the time. These are the 5 topics that I want to talk about today. The Buddhist perspective on community that goes back to the original Sangha that the Buddha created and what have you, and what that was about. And then defining what we mean by harmony in community. Looking at some of the obstacles that we have, and perhaps in your little reflection that we did at the beginning of today, you came up with your own obstacles. I'll ask at the end of that discussion if there was anything anyone else realized was a factor in creating disharmony in their community. And then fourthly, what tools do we have in Buddhism, as well as just general tools to utilize in creating a more harmonious environment? And then finally, some more practical suggestions for dealing with conflict in community. Kind of an important topic, because we are going to have conflict at times. There are going to be differing points of view, and it's important to have the right perspective on working with that. So I'm taking a little bit from a book called Awakening Together by Larry Yang. Kind of a nice book. I haven't read all of it yet. He says in the beginning, the etymology of the word community is from the Latin terms cum, meaning together or among each other, and munus, which indicates giving or a gift or exchange. So it's kind of this idea of we are in together, giving to each other, exchanging with each other. He goes on to discuss that to some degree here. Integrated into one word, community represents a form of exchanging or giving among and between each other. It suggests the development of relationship and the act of relating with each other, since in the act of relating, there is exchange and sharing. I was kind of reminded when I went over this definition of community of something that His Holiness said many years ago. Jeffrey Hopkins, in one of his books, alludes to this, because he used to be His Holiness's translator. And His Holiness was speaking, and he said, and he used a different word than community, he said, society is kindness. And Jeffrey Hopkins said that he thought that this was like a mistake in the way that His Holiness was putting the terms together. And he said, Your Holiness, don't you mean that society depends upon kindness, or is benefited by kindness? And His Holiness says, no, I mean society is kindness. In a similar way, we can say community is kindness, is relationship, is people functioning together, working with each other, finding a way to relate to each other that involves that kind of exchange, an exchange of our qualities, an exchange of our ideas, our effort, our energy. And so community is a wonderful word. I mean, we don't maybe use it quite as much. And of course, it has many different meanings. If you go to a dictionary meaning of community, it talks about all the ways we can say we're kind of a part of a community. The community of women, for example, those of you who are female, the community of people of different races, different sexual orientation, what have you. So This source resonates, this source of this word community resonates with the Buddhist concept of the practice of Sangha. Giving to each other is a visible and visceral way of bringing community off the page as a concept and into life as a relational reality. So we see this concept of giving. I mean, it just doesn't mean physically giving, material giving. It means what we give in terms of who we are and how we relate to each other, how we actually contribute to the concept of community and to the harmony within the community. So the word Sangha has been mentioning. These are the three things I want to talk about first in terms of the value of a Buddhist perspective on community and what is entailed in that. The initial community, of course, that the Buddha developed, the Sangha, this is I don't know how many, there were over 1,200 at least monks and nuns. Initially, there was a community of monks, and then the women involved in the teachings wanted to form a community of nuns. Of course, these were people who took ordination, and we still carry on to this day the ordination of monks and nuns in the Buddhist community. But this was quite revolutionary at the time when the Buddha collected both men and women into their communities and gave them ordination and provided a place of support in their practice. Of course, we don't all live in that type of an environment now. Very few of us actually do. Even in the FPMT, there's only a handful of sort of communities that are more monastic in that tone. But it became the model for how we want to be able to be with each other. We recognize that there are these three jewels that we take refuge in. The Buddha being, of course, the source of all of these teachings, who lived some 2,600 years ago. The Dharma, the teachings that he gave, which are really our primary refuge, because that's what we keep going back to. That's what we're going to talk about today, is using those teachings in our interaction and community. But the third of the three jewels is the Sangha. Of course, the Sangha is technically those beings who've developed their minds to a greater degree. We often talk about those who've had this kind of direct insight into the nature of reality, which again, I'm not going to talk so much about today, but the idea is that that's a superior form of practitioner that we do want to depend upon to a greater degree. But for most of us, what we have in our lives is a spiritual community that are the practitioners that we play with, work with, practice with. These are people who we develop good relationship with. And that's the idea behind a community. Many of you have developed friendships, I'm sure, with those people in community with you at Tupten Kungali. And this is an important aspect of it, a dimension of community that supports us in terms of how we practice the Dharma. I mean, I'll share one brief story. I found it interesting. One gentleman that I was working with who came to the conclusion after spending a lot of time, because he is a bit of a loner, a bit more isolated, and this was even before the pandemic. And so he went through a lot of challenges when the pandemic isolated him even further. But nonetheless, he came to the conclusion that he really was missing that third jewel in his life. Many of us come to Buddha's teachings and we feel really quite content saying, oh, I have great faith in the Buddha and I practice these teachings, but maybe we don't feel that we need a community as greatly as what the Buddha emphasized in his initial sort of plan for Buddhism. Well, we do need community. We do need those people that we interact with. And especially when we begin to study more deeply with others, we recognize how much they are of value to us, kind of keeping us in line with the teachings, keeping us in a deep understanding of the teachings and so on. So our modern communities, we use the term Sangha to refer to them. It's technically not absolutely correct. And oftentimes even Sangha, if it's used in a more conventional sense, refers to the monastic community that exists, not necessarily whether they have those deeper realizations. But modern communities are certainly, as it says here, a place of practice, a place of inclusivity and belonging. And this is so important for many people because when people come to a spiritual tradition, they do see often that they want to belong. They want to feel that they're a part of something that is bigger than them, that they can contribute to and be benefited by. So this is kind of a more traditional way of looking at Buddhist perspective on community, but it's important to also bring in the Mahayana Buddhist perspective on community. Here in the FPMT, it's, as was said, the foundation for the preservation of the Mahayana tradition. So we see that our community in particular becomes a support on the path, and that it's a part of our practice. It's a part of what we do to take these teachings and bring them to life. Now, again, I am focusing mainly on Buddhist communities here, but many of the ideals we're talking about do relate to other communities. So keep that in mind as we go through all of this. But in particular, our Buddhist community, our Sangha, our organizations in the FPMT, for example, are a place for connection to especially practice love and compassion. We're going to talk about these two qualities, but these are really at the heart of the Mahayana. Now, not denying that other Buddhist communities practice these, because they do. Every Buddhist tradition practices love and compassion to some degree. But in the Mahayana, we always want to be taking on that motivation that is driving us to have the greatest level of love and compassion, a wish to help others to a degree that goes far beyond what we can currently do by striving to become enlightened for the sake of all beings. Again, this is our Bodhichitta motivation. This is where we started today in some degree. I didn't, couch it in those words, but nonetheless, this is a kind of the orientation we want to have around looking at community. So let's talk about harmony in community. What does harmony mean? Well, we all know this word, right? We've heard it many times. And one definition of harmony is a pleasing combination of elements in a whole. And I actually like this as a very simple definition of what we mean by harmony. What it kind of speaks to is the reality that you have to have many things that are somewhat different, somewhat divergent, that come together that create a sense of harmony. If you think about like a symphony, for example, and all the various instruments in a symphony, they're all really quite unique, right? The sound of an oboe is very different from the sound of a violin, or the sound of a flute from the sound of a timpani, or what have you. These are all different sounds that are brought together that create a kind of a harmony, being in accord with each other, an ability to complement each other and to enhance through their coming together the end product. And so the end product, of course, of community is to have that welcoming, inclusive space for people to feel that they are part of, for people to grow together, for people to learn to love and generate all the qualities together. So this is, again, I think a wonderful definition as a starting point for harmony. Another book that I researched, read many years ago when I was researching for teaching this initially, I think the first time I taught this was back in 2008 here at Thupten Norberling, is a book, a wonderful little book called Joyfully Together by Thich Nhat Hanh. Of course, Thich Nhat Hanh passed away, I think towards the end of last year it was, I think. I don't think it was, I think it was towards the end of last year. And he was, of course, renowned for having developed this wonderful concept of community in the various places that he established, Plum Village in Europe and what have you. But he says, harmony is not something that we achieve perfectly, but it, like the mindfulness trainings, is a guiding light that we are always practicing and moving toward. All the activities of the Sangha are for the purpose of cultivating harmony. It's kind of an interesting statement to say everything we do as members of a spiritual community is for the purpose of cultivating harmony. Because the more that we align ourselves with the teachings, the more that then that manifests in regard to our working with others, the more that then that infuses the entire environment and everyone involved. But I like this concept that, again, it's not something we achieve perfectly. It's something we strive continually towards. Being in harmony does not mean that we do not disagree or make mistakes and miss opportunities to understand one another. It means that we are doing our best and that there is no division or split within the Sangha. Of course, I want to take just a moment to talk about this concept, because this is actually said to be one of the worst things in the history of Buddhism. Was at the time of the Buddha, his cousin Devadatta was actually quite involved in creating what they called a schism in the Sangha, where there was this huge rift. And there was, this becomes a very negative impact, has a very negative impact on the community. Why? Because it stops everyone from going forward. While there is that conflict, while there is this inability for people to see eye to eye, then no progress is being made forward. And in fact, things revert. They go back to a place where we get into our baser emotions and things manifest at that time that are not very healthy. Of course, I would, hope that all of our communities avoid that level of split or division in the community, the Sangha. But sometimes these things will arise. That's why, again, part of today is to look at how we work with conflict and make sure that we have some tools that we can bring to bear in the most minor conflicts, as well as when there are major things happening. Things do happen. One of the things that the Buddha, of course, acknowledges is that we are all imperfect. We're working towards what we might call a perfect state of Buddhahood. But perfect is kind of in our conditioned state, not something we can accomplish. It's something that we are continually moving towards and just trying to work on our own little rough edges, polishing out the things that we don't want to experience in our own minds. And then by virtue of that, creating, again, a better interaction with others, a better relationship. But if this is the dynamic we're working with, humans are not perfect. We have faults, we have these delusions, and that's what we're going to be going into next, of course, is these obstacles that we have that get in the way. So don't expect that, again, having harmony in the community means that it's always going to be there. It means it becomes a goal that we continually strive towards. Thich Nhat Hanh continues, he says, we are sincerely practicing the way of liberation and peace for ourselves and for each other. We never forget our commitment to each other, our commitment to ourselves, to practice mindfulness night and day, dwelling happily in the present moment. Of course, this is a bit of his perspective, of his tradition. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would say, not just a sort of mindfulness that is simply being present, but a mindfulness that is aware of how we want to be all the time. This is the most valuable way we can use our mindfulness. Mindfulness being that sort of non-forgetfulness and ability to be present with what's going on, is to infuse every moment with the values that we're trying to live up to. Again, the Mahayana values that we'll be looking at. And then he concludes, this is the last I'm going to share from him, harmony is our daily practice. It is our most essential practice. So I think this is, again, just nice little words from Thich Nhat Hanh, who, as I said, I think was really quite successful in developing community in his tradition. Again, the Vietnamese Zen tradition that he was renowned for having spread quite a bit through his amazing teachings and presence. Now we're going to go on to talk about these obstacles to having harmony in community. And as many of you'll see, as we go through this, it's not like we're coming up with a whole new list of things. There's a few things that perhaps play a role in community that are a little bit different than when we're interacting with others in other ways. But nonetheless, it's going to be the usual suspects, as I have, that's the title of my list for some of these that we're going to look at. Why? Because we see that the same way that these things play out in terms of the disturbing our own mind is the way that they also disturb community. So we're not going to, again, see anything too earth-shaking, but nonetheless, we do have to acknowledge these are the things that get in the way. These are the problematic states of mind that become hindrances to developing our true sense of harmony with others. So the usual suspects, as the Buddha said in his teaching on the Four Noble Truths, why do we have suffering, difficulty, problems, conflict? Karma and delusions. The first of these, karma, is our past actions that ripen into difficult situations and or difficult people in our lives, as well as our present actions and behavior that may not be as skillful as we would like them to be. It is important that we talk about karma because karma is essentially this ongoing thing that we're always dealing with. We have the karma of the past, the things we've created through our past mental actions primarily, as well as the physical and verbal things that we've done on the basis of that. All those have planted seeds that then ripen into our experiences. And that's kind of the setup for how we then create new karma. When we have those experiences, then we sometimes react in wholesome, healthy, positive ways, and we can manage our karma that way to have better results in the future. Or we can act in negative ways that cause things to simply continue to manifest in harmful, non-beneficial ways. So particularly when we're talking about conflict or problems or difficulty, things coming into community that are a bit more challenging for us. Because when things are going well, it's maybe not quite so challenging, right? When everybody's getting along and you have smiling faces at the center and everybody you meet and work with is all very resonant with each other, well then you don't have to work so hard to practice. It's during the more difficult times when we tend to have our own obstacles arising. Something happens karmically, that there's a shift and we suddenly have to adjust our own mind. And if we adjust our mind in a positive way, well then wonderful. Then we can have a much better impact on restoring that harmony, renewing it, and going forward with that. If we react from the place of what got us into that situation, the place of these negative tendencies, then we're going to create a karma that's simply going to perpetuate that type of conflict, that type of difficulty. This is the law of karma that we are all working with day in and day out. Karma, again, is a really, really big topic. I'm somewhat simplifying it today in what I'm talking about. But essentially, it means that once more, when we go back to that idea of mindfulness that Thich Nhat Hanh was speaking to, we have to be really mindful of what we're doing constantly with our thoughts, which is where everything starts, with our words, and then, of course, with our actions. Because this is how we get in trouble. This is also how we get out of trouble. This is also how we create all the greatest benefits for ourselves and others. The other aspect that is in the second noble truth that the Buddha taught, the true causes of all of our situation of dissatisfaction and what have you, is our deluded states of mind. I often call these afflictions, delusions. The afflicted emotion sometimes is a term we use. These are the unskillful mindsets that interfere with our inner peace as well as our being at peace with others. These are really important to identify. There's an entire course, I think I taught it for Thupten Kungaling a few years ago on minds and mental factors, essentially picking apart our minds so that we get to understand, as Venerable Rabina says, who all our crazy roommates are. We have kind of our own kind of sense of self that's abiding with all these different states of mind. And we have to identify clearly, this is a harmful state of mind. This is a helpful state of mind. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes we're not even clear about what those are. Some of them are really obvious, as we'll see, go through some of those shortly. But some of them maybe think that they're in our best interest, but they're not. They're actually very destructive. So we have to be really clear about what these deluded states of mind are, be mindful of when they're arising, and do everything we can to counteract them. So this is the main topic of what we're going to talk about today, is kind of how do we make sure that we're attentive enough, mindful enough, so that when these begin to arise, we see them clearly for what they are, and we are able to address them. It's a bit of what we were talking about last Thursday in the class on mind training that I'm leading. So you might hear a few things that you'll recognize. So I've got about 8 different states of mind that we would include in this category of a deluded state. And I want to go through each of them somewhat individually. I want to start with what is probably at the core of so much of the disharmony that we have when we're working with others, again, whether it be in our family life, our work life, or in our Dharma communities. It's what we call self-centeredness. Now, again, self-centeredness at a very subtle level isn't really a problem, because we can still have a mind that is seeking our own welfare, even at a subtler level. It becomes distorted, though, frequently when we put our own needs as being more important than the needs of others. And we even become negligent of the needs of others and might even harm them in the process of getting what we need. This mind is sometimes also called the mind of self-cherishing, but it's one of the particular kind of negative states of mind, deluded states of mind, that manifests throughout so much of our other delusions. Why? Because we're sort of setting ourselves up as having that level of attention that we need and the things that we need to satisfy ourselves. And we become blind to what other people need. I would say most of our conflict in community comes about with that mindset being there to some degree. And then, of course, other things following the remainder of the list that I'm going to go through. But the self-centeredness can be corrected, of course, by the mind that begins to cherish others, to think that others' needs are similar to one's own. Every one of us goes about our day kind of trying to get what we want, trying to obtain our own happiness and peace. And we have to see the value of that. In fact, that very fundamental meditation that is you're encouraged to do constantly, to think about our equality to others, the reality that every single being, whether it's an ant crawling on your counter, or an alligator in the swamps, or whatever, or a person on the street, every one of them is driven by a fundamental need, fundamental desire to be happy and to avoid what causes pain and suffering. Every being is exactly the same in that way. But for some reason, this mind of self-centeredness thinks that my happiness and my freedom from suffering are more important than others. And oftentimes we even relegate people to the position of satisfying that for us. Most of our close relationships with others, in fact, when we're in a relationship that we call like an intimate relationship, there's some element of self-centeredness involved, where we're looking for what we get out of that relationship. And we think mostly about that, as opposed to thinking about what can we do for the other? How can we satisfy their needs and help them to have happiness and be free from suffering? So we see that again, these are very different states of mind, and we have to be clear about when this self-centeredness is manifesting. This is one of our worst enemies, as it's said in the mind training teachings, because it steers us down the path of having many of these other negative states of mind. The second one going across is stubbornness. It's kind of interesting. We don't, those of you who took part in that course on the mental factors, all these various, parts of our mind, we didn't talk about stubbornness. It's not on the list. But it's an interesting one because I think it has a particular dynamic in relationship with others when we're in community with others. It's a form of kind of obstinacy. And in fact, the Buddha himself spoke to this and the need for his spiritual community. Of course, the teachings that he gave to the Sangha at that time are what are called the Vinaya. That term was in the slide earlier. The Vinaya sets out very clearly how people are to interact with each other. It's a set of rules that every monastic abides by. And so essentially, one of them was, to avoid this kind of obstinacy that makes one closed to seeing the points of view of others, even being corrected by others, learning from others. Well, if we have a stubbornness, and I can speak to stubbornness, I was born as a Taurus, and Tauruses are known to be a bit stubborn, and I have that streak. I've tried to work with it as best as I can. But no doubt every one of us has a little bit of stubbornness that manifests particularly when we're being corrected or when somebody is trying to help us and we don't think we need that help or whatever the case might be. And if it manifests in these group interactions, we can see that it becomes a block, once more to things kind of moving forward. And especially for me to learn from that situation. Our learning from everything that we encounter is an important quality that we want to bring to Buddhism as well. And if we're constantly stubborn, kind of thinking that, we know best and who are you to correct me and who are you to do this and what have you, well, then again, we're not going to move in a positive direction. And the value, the benefit of being in community with others is that they're often a mirror for us. They often can hold something up to us and say, oh, have you seen those faults yet? And you go, oh, okay, now I can see them. You're pointing them out to me. Thank you very much. But for most of us, when somebody holds a mirror up to us, we want to crack the mirror. We want to do whatever we can to avoid looking at that. That's that stubbornness, that sense of kind of not willing to go to that place of learning from that opportunity. So this is an important one to be cognizant of. There was a little thing I found on the internet about stubbornness, because again, it's not something that we frequently look at in Buddhism, at least in our traditional practice. In this little article, this is let me see if I can find who, Lynn, I think is her name. She wrote this. She says, what are our options when somebody does kind of confront us to kind of overcome that stubbornness? What can we ask ourselves? And she says the first thing is to say, what is this experience right now? And I think this applies to all of this. What are we experiencing right now? Because usually with stubbornness, there sometimes is a little bit of anger. There might even be some, kind of disbelief or shock at what the person is saying. There might be some other, pride that we're going to look at pride shortly, but pride can also be present. Then secondly, did I hear and understand correctly what the other person said? A lot of times when we have stubbornness arising, it's because we're hearing it through a particular lens and we're not necessarily listening to exactly what they're saying. And at those times, and it's really important that we do open up to hearing what they have to say. And then thirdly, did the person's comment reveal something about the speaker? Sometimes people do say something that maybe is more revealing about them than it is about us. That is a possibility. But nonetheless, the main thing is the last point. Is there any truth in what the person said? A lot of times we're not willing to look at that truth. If somebody criticizes us or says something that that they feel that we're not being a harmonious part, we're like the oboe that's not playing the notes correctly or something, and people are pointing that out to us, well, then we become resistant to that because we don't want to look at that truth. We don't want to look at our own faults. So stubbornness, I think, is a really important one to overcome, and recognize that, again, it's very different from what we might call our determination or our steadfastness in our practice. That's a good quality to have, to be very determined to do what we can to continue to move forward. Being stubborn and resistant to hearing what others have to say, I think, is really quite problematic. I'm spending just a little more time on it because it's not something, again, we talk about so much. But that obstinacy can become a real problem in group dynamics in particular. Number 3 there, the anger. Anger, of course, and I'm going to talk about anger and resentment together because these two often arise together. This is one of the most problematic minds in community. And this is when it becomes kind of the fire of anger. It can be very, very destructive. If we look at fire here in New Mexico, we're dealing, unfortunately, with many different fires. And we see that just even the small amount of fire, like one of the fires that was started by a controlled burn that had just simply been festering underneath the surface. And then eventually when it got warmer, it became a huge blaze. This is what anger does. And of course, many of us have subtler forms of anger. We have irritation. We have kind of a little bit of an aversion energy or something, and we're not really addressing it at that level. Sometimes we kind of keep these building up until eventually they come out of our mouths or into physical actions that are not so wholesome. Anger is one of the most destructive emotions, and we need to be able to practice patience instead of succumbing to that mind. What is happening with anger? And we can see how it's related to self-centeredness because it's once more totally about me, about how I am being offended or what is happening and how it affects me. It's reacting from a place of wanting that to be addressed and be done with and be out of my face. And so we can often again do and say things that we regret on the basis of this mind of anger. So there's, again, many resources out there to work with anger. This is one of the main things that the Buddha recognizes an obstacle on our spiritual path, as well as in being in community. When anger kind of festers into resentment, this is where, again, we've had those opportunities to be with particular people, and we have found over time through our development of that anger that we even resent them, that we have on the basis of what they have done to us or what we feel they have done to others. That resentment oftentimes manifests in us doing very harmful things. So again, I think either one of these, we can see the negative kind of energy behind it. Again, all the teachers in the books that I mentioned earlier, talk about the harmfulness of anger, the destructive force of anger. And of course, we need to be able to resolve these situations as quickly as possible. If you let them fester, then they become these grudges, this resentment, and we end up again seeing much greater harm on the basis of that. So I don't know that, again, I need to speak too much about that since we know the mind of anger to some degree. Jealousy. Of course, jealousy is something that manifests in relation to the qualities or possessions or whatever of another. We see that person and kind of, if we're working with them through the lens of jealousy, that can affect our ability to be in harmony with them, to be in community with them. Jealousy is kind of interesting because, again, one of the things I've noticed in my years of practicing Buddhism in my own mind, as well as talking to others, is a tendency that we have to judge others. We're constantly looking at kind of others, assessing their qualities, trying to figure out who they are, and then putting them in some sort of category on the basis of that. And this is a really horrible way of approaching things. I remember it was Jeffrey Hopkins who said in his book, again, I think it's called The Truthful Heart, where he talked about how he decided that instead of having these judgments towards people, he was just going to meet everyone that he encountered with a simple thought of, may you be happy, may you have happiness. And so essentially he kind of took all that kind of that inner dialogue that we have that goes on every time we meet somebody and we go, oh, who is this person and how do they stack up against me and what are all these various things? Jealousy is a natural outcome of a lot of that judgment because we end up, if we see the other person as someone who is superior to us in some way, then we become quite jealous of their qualities. We can't kind of be with them and be accepting of our own deficiencies and what they have and rejoice in what they have. In fact, rejoicing is said to be the antidote to this jealous mind, to really think about how wonderful that this person has these qualities, that they can come into this community and be involved in, helping us and helping others and what have you. So the next one on the list, I don't need to go back to it, is greed. Of course, greed, when we talked earlier, we talked about community being based in the concept of giving, of it being about giving freely of one's time, one's energy, one's resources, one's qualities, to benefit others. It's an exchange. We are benefited by what others do. We benefit others by what we do. If we have this greedy mind that is holding on to everything and is not wanting to spend the time, not wanting to go the extra mile, not wanting to do whatever is involved in upholding community, then that becomes an obstacle as well. And maybe we won't have such a huge impact on the overall community if it keeps functioning okay, but we will not be a part of that. Like, again, go back to the symphony, you won't hear the oboe quite as much, or the oboe won't even be there. Maybe the symphony still sounds fine without that one instrument, but to ideally bring everyone together, we have to get rid of that tendency of being miserly, kind of holding on to what we have. Let's go on to the last couple. This is two of the main culprits that we have in our delusions, our store of crazy roommates. The first is attachment. Attachment, as I mentioned earlier when we talked about self-centeredness, this is the state of mind where we're looking at things solely from the point of view of what do I get out of it? Because we do gain something from being in community, the mind of attachment can arise at times where we really think about what am I getting out of all of this? Now, again, I'm not saying that if you're making an assessment about whether you want to belong to a community or not, that you shouldn't think in terms of what am I getting out of it? Because I think that's a part and parcel of what each of us go through when we come into some form of community, is to look at it and say, how is this in line with what I'm looking for? But we don't want to do it with a mind of attachment. We want to do it with a mind of, is this community giving me the support and the strength I need to be able to take these Buddhist ideals and make them, a reality for me? We don't want to be looking at it from the point of view of what can these people do for me, and really being that kind of, again, selfishly focused. Attachment is where we have pleasant things that we experience and that we're about, and we want them for ourselves. We want to grasp onto them and not be separated from them. Excuse me, again, it's very different from the mind that is very dedicated and committed to community because one sees one's own benefit from being in community. Because again, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where somebody would have kind of a sort of disorientation around being in community, really looking at it solely from the point of view, what does community do for me, and not being willing to participate in that exchange of giving to others. The last one was pride. Pride is something that we often point to in Buddhism as having a very unfortunate sort of effect on our spiritual practice. We covered this a little bit in regard to the mind training teachings last week, or maybe it was the week before, where essentially we have the when pride is manifest, then it's very, very hard for us again to learn from others. It comes a bit of that stubbornness as well, right? When we think that we're so great and we're in a superior position because of the qualities we have, the learning we have, whatever, and then we think that others are relegated to an inferior position, well, then we don't benefit from them. And there's this analogy that they use in Tibet. Of course, in Tibet, you're dealing with this huge, Himalayan mountain range, and then the Tibetan plateau that is underneath. And so essentially, they say you don't want to be like the mountaintop, right? Because if you're at the mountaintop, there's nothing growing there. You're well above the tree line. There's nothing happening. And of course, down in the valleys of the plateau is the ideal place to be. Why? Because all of the water from the mountains goes down to that lowest point, and it creates very lush green areas. So essentially, this is the ideal mindset for us to have, is to be like the valleys and not like the mountains, to be in the position of being of service to others and holding others very dear, and not thinking of ourselves as being so kind of important. Again, pride takes our sense of self and elevates it to that greater degree, and thinks that we have all these things that it's often an exaggeration. It's not really in line with reality at all. In fact, in Buddhism, they often talk about 7 levels of pride. I'm only going to talk about 3 of them because we can see how pride can become really distorted when we're interacting with others. Of course, it goes back to judgment too, right? That I just mentioned a short while ago. We make a judgment on the basis of that person. We either see them as being inferior to us, perhaps we might see them as equal to us, and there might be those people who we see as superior to us. The mind of pride, though, thinks that, first of all, and these are 3 dimensions of it, we think that we're superior to those who are inferior. Well, you might think in some regard we are, but we don't know all the qualities of that person who we see as inferior. Master Shantideva, this great, amazing Indian Buddhist saint, all the practitioners in the monastery with him, they only saw him do three things. Essentially, they saw him eat, sleep, and defecate. And so they called him three discriminations. They thought he was like the laziest monk in the whole community. And essentially, he was this amazing scholar, and he taught and wrote these texts that are just really, revered to this day. Well, again, we don't know the qualities of somebody. If we have a pride that thinks somebody's inferior, well, maybe we're not seeing the whole picture. Maybe we're not seeing everything that they're about. So it's really worth checking up. And when pride manifests towards someone that's inferior, do we have complete knowledge of all of their qualities? Secondly, we can have even a pride that thinks we're better than those that are equal to us. We all do practice with people that perhaps we came into the centers, into Buddhism at around the same time, and we've been developing together, and we might have a feeling that we're superior to them. Well, once more, is that really legitimate? Is that really a mind that is helpful? Of course not. It keeps us from learning from that person as well as others. But it may not be based in reality either. That person also may have greater qualities than us. And lastly, we might even think that we're better than those who are superior to us. I mean, if you said something like, oh, the Dalai Lama, he's got nothing on me, of course we know that this would be absurd because the Dalai Lama shows just amazing qualities. But even those that we practice with who might have greater qualities than us, we might be blind to that. Kind of go back to the example of Shantideva, who again was this quite astounding scholar. He had written these texts and sort of hid them away in his monk cell or whatever. And so we don't know the qualities of others. And so somebody, again, might be exhibiting to be superior to us. If we think that we're better than them, well, we really should check up. Do we really have those qualities? And whatever we are seeing, is that really the true picture? So pride, again, I don't want to parrot on about pride for too long, but I think it's one of the most important things that we need to overcome. With our pride, we're often very easily wounded. And of course, when things do happen in community that affect us, we might not feel that we need to address it because we sort of rise above it in the state of pride. So these are all, again, as I said, the usual suspects, the things that we often find are behind this, our karma that creates these situations, and then of course what we do on the basis of them, and then these deluded states, a number of which we've looked at here. So before I go on, I did want to open it up. Was there anything anyone kind of found in your own investigation at the beginning of today when I asked you to take a look at when there was disharmony in community as to what was going on, either in someone else, though that may be of limited benefit, but certainly in yourself? Does anyone want to share anything? Yes, please, Lou. Yeah, unmute yourself. And no, oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had something. Okay. Anyone? Was there anyone in the Gompa who wanted to share anything? No. Okay.
I will.
Oh, please.
John, it's Ralph.
Great, Ralph. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your teaching today. It just occurred. Well, it didn't just occur to me. It just seems to me that the root of all this really is attachment, right? And everything kind of seems to me comes down to that primary root of attachment. Is there some accuracy in that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think, Ralph, that's a good comment. The Buddha himself, when I mentioned the second noble truth earlier, when he taught the Sutra on the Four Noble Truths, the very first truth, of course, there is dukkha, this unsatisfactory state we're dealing with. The second, that there is a cause for that. In that sutra, he actually said, desire, attachment is the cause, craving is the cause. These are different words we use for that kind of impulse that we have. We can see that that's sort of the most operative way that the mind gets involved in all this. And of course, everything else stems to some degree from that. As Venerable Urbina often points out, even anger or hatred stems from attachment, because attachment wants to get things in a particular way and is really, craving that. And when we don't get that, when we're thwarted in getting that, that's when anger arises. That's when we get upset, right? So you can say to some degree that we have a deeper root, that is this root of ignorance that I haven't talked about so much today. This is what those beings that are in the true Sangha have developed the antidote to that to a deeper degree. But essentially that ignorance is kind of a deeper cause of error. But the manifest way that it's happening is the attachment, the craving that we have on the basis of that ignorance. It keeps us bound in wanting to get things for ourselves, being negligent of the needs of others, and doing everything we can under the control of that type of delusion. So did you have any more things you wanted to say on that, Ralph? Or?
I don't think so. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a good observation. I think we can say that to some degree, just as the Buddha said in that first sutra, that first discourse, that the root problem that we are dealing with is craving. In fact, in many of the Theravadan traditions, because they follow the Pali Canon, which includes that sutra, not that we don't follow that sutra, but certainly they take that orientation that's set out there. They often are talking about desire and craving as being the cause of all of our problems and difficulties. By the way, those of you, oh yeah, please, Ralph.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to suggest one thing that becomes problematic for me sometimes, and that is, or one of the things I have to achieve, and that is a deeper understanding of attachment, right? Because we have this Western view, the societal view of what attachment means, usually in romantic relationship or whatever, or family or familial relationships. But for me, I've had to discover that it really has nothing to do with that. And I get very confused sometimes, because when you look at other things like pride or self-centeredness, I mean, there are reason sometimes for me to be concerned about myself, but becoming attached to that can become the issue. So it's a real interesting lesson to learn as time goes by.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is really one of the biggest challenges of our work as Buddhists, is to be very cued into when attachment is arising. It's very subtle, because again, you go from that place of simply that there is a desire to be happy to it becoming a desire for happiness for yourself that is, again, becomes really exclusive. It becomes something that guides us in a particular way. And we start having these unhealthy relationships with others as well as with the objects of our attachment. So it's an important one to be very attentive to. I'd say it's probably one of the hardest ones to uproot and to be real clear about how it's manifesting. And as you said, I think in the Western psychology, concepts of attachment has a very different kind of ideal of what we mean by attachment. And here we're talking about, again, a distorted state of mind. Attachment essentially is doing a couple of things. The first thing is it is relating always to something that is pleasant, always something that's giving us what we are at our deeper level seeking. And if we were simply content with that experience of pleasure, it would be fine. We wouldn't have too many problems probably. But what happens is, first of all, we overlay on top of that attachment an exaggerated pleasantness. We make the entire thing into something that is pleasant. We even say it's more pleasant than what it possibly is. I like to use the example of music for this, because we all have different music tastes, perhaps. Maybe even there's some of you that don't like music at all. I have known some people that never really listen to music, and I'm like, wow, I like music a lot. I have a lot of attachment to music. But every one of us probably has different music types that we like, that we are more attached to than others. Maybe we like a number of them, but go, oh, I really like to listen to fill in the blank. Well, you are taking that type of music, which is one among a whole array of music. So when you start taking, world music and all these other things into consideration, there are so many different forms of music. Some of which we might find disharmonious, or we might not find really pleasing. But other people would find that totally pleasing, right? So we are taking what we find to be pleasing, that particular type of music, and thinking that it is pleasant completely. There's nothing unpleasant about it. Anybody who doesn't see the pleasantness of that music is, deaf. They can't possibly hear, because that's inherent within it. That's part of it. But then we think it's so much better than all the other music, and we imbue it with those sorts of exaggerated qualities. This is what attachment is doing. That's the first part of it, it's looking at what is a pleasant experience and elevating it to an even larger degree, painting the entire thing pleasant. Then we want to hold on to it and not be separated from it. We want to continue to have that experience. And in fact, we get upset and angry if somebody interferes with that process. Somebody turns down our music, or somebody starts playing music that we don't like that's louder than our music, and we crank up our music, and then they crank up their music. We have a whole battle over it, right? So this is how attachment manifests, is that it is exaggerating the qualities of pleasantness that are there, because we are having a pleasant experience, but those pleasant qualities aren't even there inherently. They aren't there as part of that object. Why? Because my favorite music that I listen to, I could play for somebody who, doesn't like that, and they would think, again, that's horrible music. Get it off. I don't want to listen to it anymore. They're not seeing any pleasantness at all. I'm exaggerating the pleasantness that I'm experiencing. But again, they're not seeing it because it's not inherently there. And then again, that other tendency, I grasp at it and I don't want to be parted from it. Most of us in the West, of course, we've gotten really good at this because we have such a culture that feeds our pleasure. And so anytime you want anything, practically in our big cities in the country, anytime of the day, anytime at night, you can go and find whatever it is that you want probably. Oh, I want Thai food. Oh, good. There's a Thai food restaurant right there. Oh, I want, to experience this, experience that. Well, this is kind of just feeding this whole cycle of attachment. And then, as was pointed out, when attachment doesn't get what it wants, that's when the anger, the aversion energy arises. And then we have pride and jealousy and all the various other iterations. So, okay. Any other comments on? Yes, please. Another hand up in the Gompa.
Why don't you come over here so we can hear you with the speaker, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Hi, Don.
Hi. Who's talking? I can't see you.
Oh, this is Margaret.
Hi, Margaret. Good.
Hi. I I was thinking that this is a great list that you pointed us to in obstacles, because the obstacles are, they're a root for our own suffering. And being cognizant of that can give one the impetus to really work on them when you just, plainly think, this makes me suffer. Anger makes me suffer. Jealousy makes me suffer, et cetera. And, I really appreciated you going over that because it really helped me to bring something else to the table about, working on these obstacles, within myself, within the community, et cetera. So
Wonderful.
that's all I wanted to say.
Oh, Margaret, well, thank you for sharing that. No, I think it is important that we do see, as Margaret's saying, the initial thing is that these hurt ourselves. Going back to that idea of the karma, again, if every time that we meet a difficult situation, say there's somebody in your community that you don't like, and when they come up to you and you have to, you're not enjoying talking to them, you're planting the seeds of your own future suffering, of your own future being in difficult situations, having difficult people in your life, what have you. If you're willing at that time to be open and practice some of the qualities that we're going to talk about, being compassionate, caring, respectful, kind, cherishing that other person, then you are the immediate beneficiary of a little bit of more lightness in your own mind. Karmically, you create some opportunity for more pleasant experiences in your life, and you contribute to the overall harmony in the community. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Lou, did you want to share something? I wasn't sure. Okay. When you put your hand up, I'm sometimes not sure. Okay. Anyone else? Anything? Okay. So let's go on to the other side of it. Again, these, as I said, are sort of the usual suspects. As I said, there's a few in here that I think play a particular role, but one more thing before we leave this, though, and this is kind of segueing to some degree into what we're going into next, is this wonderful verse that was from the mind training course. Some of you recall this, and many of you have encountered this text before, a really concise text called the 8 Verses of Thought Transformation. Geshe Langri Tongpa, this amazing practitioner that lived about 1,000 years ago, and his advice is still so relevant for us. Vigilant, the moment one of these delusions or any delusion appears in my mind, endangering myself and others, I shall confront and avert it without delay. So again, this is speaking to what our job is as Buddhist practitioners, and what Margaret was just saying, and that if we have the cognizance of what is happening in our minds, the moment that that appears, we see that it endangers both ourselves and others. So we have to confront and avert it without delay. We have to do something that is opposing to it so that we don't move in that direction again and keep stepping in it again and again and again. And rather we embrace our own welfare and the welfare of others. So let's look at some of these tools to utilize in fostering harmony with others. Some of them might seem kind of obvious as opposites to what we've looked at, but others maybe again shed a little bit more light on what you have in your sort of utility belt, your, that Batman hat or whatever. You can pull out this and work with that at a time when you're experiencing some difficulty with others. But essentially, all these tools that we need are included in what is called skillful means. In the Sanskrit, it's upaya. Upaya is essentially referring to the fact that we need to be able to act in ways that are beneficial to others out of a place of understanding and other qualities, loving kindness, compassion. So skillful means refers to the ability to respond and act effectively and appropriately to any situation. And it has a foundation of both wisdom and compassion, as well as many other qualities often, but these two in particular. So let's just talk a little bit about this idea of being able to respond appropriately to a situation. I like to sometimes use these two words to talk about how we are working with the situation: react versus respond. And it's not an absolute thing, so don't think that you can go back to some dictionary and find the meanings exactly in line with this. But our reactions are just that. We react, we act again and again in habitual ways. So most of that list that we just said are reactions that we tend to have. We get stubborn when somebody starts to criticize us or things don't go our way and we, have to change again or whatever. We have pride because of, the way we see ourselves in relation to others. These are our reactions, and we keep reacting them and making those sort of grooves in our minds deeper and deeper and deeper. So we fall into them quite habitually. Responding, on the other hand, is where we actually take control of our minds and we say, I'm going to intentionally cultivate qualities so that I stop falling into these habitual reactions, so that I stop perpetuating my own suffering and the suffering of others, supplanting them with more positive states of mind. And that's what that verse is speaking to. That's what this whole section is speaking to, is the fact that we need to develop that ability to find the proper response, find more appropriate ways of responding. And this can, again, all be included in what we're calling here skillful means. Now, again, we don't have perfect skillful means, and we don't have perfect insight, certainly, into any time anything is happening. But nonetheless, we can bring some level of wisdom and some investigation into what's going on before we say or act. And we certainly can bring some compassion into the situation. Wisdom and compassion are the heart of the Mahayana path. As many of you know, these are often referred to as like the two wings of a bird that allow the bird to get to its destination. Without both of them, you can't possibly get to enlightenment. Wisdom is hard to generate because we don't always, again, have perfect insight into what's going on, especially with others around us. But at least we can apply the wisdom to ourselves and say, what is going on in my own mind right now? How is that something that I can, change or alter so that I don't bring that into my interactions with others, so I don't react to them in ways that will be harmful? On the other hand, compassion, we can absolutely practice that and try to think of what others need to alleviate their suffering, to have greater, peace and well-being. And we'll be a beneficiary of that too. Again, the more that we create harmony with others, the more that we benefit as well. So skillful means, you don't really, again, have perfect skillful means until you're a Buddha, but we can practice skillful means. And essentially, that's what we're looking at in this section, is how do we practice skillful means? Just a little quote here from Lama Lungdup again. We have to examine ourselves, particularly our attitude with respect to what we are going to do and what will be our response to others. We have to examine this. This is very important. Sometimes we just speak really quickly and we don't even think about what we're doing. We really should always, when we're interacting with others, take a moment to look within, to reflect, to find out what is going on, what is our attitude, and how might we more effectively respond. On the other hand, if our action or attitude brings, whoops, did I say, I skipped one. Oh, here, I skipped one here. After examination, when we find that what we are thinking of and what we are going to do will help others, this is something that we need to act upon and carry out. We need to do this. So again, we do the investigation, we apply the wisdom, we see what's going on, what our attitude is, and then we see what we are going to do on the basis of that is generated by a compassionate motivation. Absolutely. Then if we've done that investigation, we then can feel confident going forward and doing that. On the other hand, if our action or attitude brings harm to others, this is something that we need to prevent and stop ourselves from doing, right? So again, he boils it down to this. We have to examine in this way, and this is my underlining and bolding here, adopt the right attitude and engage in the right action. So what we're going to mostly focus on is adopting the right attitude, because the action is going to follow from whatever the situation is, right? There might be times where I need to sit down with somebody and talk to them about what they said and make sure I'm understanding them clearly and what have you, being very compassionate in my interaction with them. Other times it might mean me doing something completely different. We have to first check our attitude and then engage in the right action. Now, having said this, and we'll go into these in just a moment, it doesn't mean that you're going to absolutely have a guaranteed positive result from what you've done. Skillful means doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to always be effective in what we're doing, because we have no control over the minds of others. Minds of others are going to hear things through their lens, are going to be perhaps dealing with their own list of obstacles to harmony and what have you. So it doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily get the result, but at least it's going to be a better bet than if we do our habitual reactions, right? If we go back to our own list of being stubborn and being prideful and jealous and all the other things, okay? So skillful means is something that we're striving to achieve, just like the way we're talking about harmony, as not an absolute, but as a continual guiding force. Whoops. So first of all, in terms of adopting the right attitude, which is what we're going to focus on, right? Because the actions will follow from these attitudes, compassion and love. Compassion and love are always these kind of companion minds. One is looking at the suffering of others and wanting to be an active force and helping to alleviate that. Love is where we look at the happiness that others are seeking and wanting to be an active force and helping them to have that. Can't emphasize the importance in the Mahayana tradition in particular of having a regular meditation on loving kindness and compassion. Again, really trying to foster these qualities so that they become a part of how we are in our communities and any aspect of our world. The second thing that was on the list, which is kind of following from that to some degree, respect for others and cherishing them. Again, we don't know all the stories behind everybody that we interact with. Developing some respect for them, an understanding of them, holding them to be dear, cherishing them. This is so important, because otherwise we might be, can really not looking at things in the way that will give some room, some space for there to be some growth and development. You know, if we lack that respect for others and we tend to not think of them as being so dear, then they're not going to be the objects of our intentions and our thoughts. So I think these, again, just follow from the same sort of thinking, these that were on that. I'm just going to share one little quote here from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And this is how he advises us to frame our minds when we're interacting with others, so that we have that respect and we cultivate a real sense of cherishing them. We think this person is the source of all your past, present, and future happiness, all the way up to enlightenment. So cherish that person. They are the most kind, the most precious one. You know, this is hard to follow. This is Rinpoche giving us these amazing words that are an ideal, but we should always be looking at that person from the vantage point of how they have benefited us so many ways in the past, and they will benefit us all the way up to enlightenment. Of course, when we look at the concept of Bodhichitta, wanting to become a Buddha for the sake of others, we need all beings to become enlightened. We need to have them as a support for our own love and compassion and our own development of our minds. In that way, every single being is precious. But even in a practical way, you know, the kindness that we experience from others indirectly as well as directly is pretty amazing. I think this was something very evident in the pandemic. I mean, many of us were, you know, at home, didn't go anywhere, weren't working, going out and whatever. Maybe we were working from home, but people still needed to be harvesting the food that we ate, packaging, shipping the food that we ate, you know, selling it, doing all the various things behind that, as well as all the other things that we needed to keep the lights on and to keep doing all the things that we do, right? We depend upon each other to a great degree. So if we have that cognizance that even our temporal happiness comes from the kindness of others, from others being involved in our lives, well, then we hold them very dear. So when we apply that concept to community, Well, we don't have Tupten Kungaling or any center without the members of that center all being a part of it. We are dependent upon each other to keep the center going, to be the volunteers that help out with all the various tasks, to be the people who contribute financially to making sure that the doors stay open, the people who attend the classes so that everything keeps running and teachers keep coming and all the stuff that happens. We see that we depend upon each other. You can't have a Dharma center of one person, right? That would be kind of silly. What would be the purpose of that? The Don Handrick Center, where Don Handrick is the only teacher, the only student, the only person who comes in the door. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So we see again that every being is to be cherished. Every single person who comes through the doors or online with your center is, absolutely a part of that. So I like, again, how Rinpoche phrases it. It's hard for us to be that embracing of others, but that's the goal. Equanimity means seeing everybody through that equal lens and even-mindedness, understanding that kind of favoring some and disliking others isn't really an appropriate response to them. We should be able to see them all as beings who want to be happy and don't want to suffer. Humility. Well, if pride is one of our main problematic minds, it's good to be humble. It's good to have that kind of an ability to see our own faults, to be able to be corrected when we have those faults manifest, when we are able to benefit others out of a sense of wanting to be of service to them rather than thinking, what can they do for me? Humility is an important quality to have. We've already touched on a little bit when we talked about pride. Faith in the three jewels, and of course in this tradition in particular, the guru, faith in Rinpoche and his amazing advice, as well as all the other teachers that we have that influence us, and the three jewels themselves. I explained them earlier, the Buddha, the Dharma, the teachings that he gave, which are our main object of faith, but then also, of course, the Sangha, the community that we practice with. If we have that real heartfelt faith, which, by the way, faith, and I have done this lecture before at Tupten Kungaling, faith in the Buddhist path isn't a blind faith. It's a faith that's very much grounded in our own experience and our own reasoning, our own working with the teachings. So we've come to really rely upon those as being absolutely our source of support. And we have confidence that they will always be there for us in that way, especially the Dharma. If we apply the Dharma, we know that we don't suffer as much, others don't suffer as much. So we keep generating that faith, keep renewing that faith throughout our practice. I think that greatly contributes to having a right attitude to how we work with each other in the concept of Sangha. And then patience and forgiveness. Of course, because anger and resentment are two of the ones that were on the list, we need patience and forgiveness. And by the way, again, patience doesn't mean I'm just going to sit there and be like a rock and not do anything. That's maybe where it starts. We have to cultivate an active form of patience that is understanding why we need to be patient. Of course, the very basic thing, which is this person who is doing this, saying something to us that we're getting angry and upset about, that this is not something independent of us. We've created the karma for that. Again, we looked at that as one of the usual suspects. It's our own karma creating that situation. We shouldn't feel horrible about that. We should just acknowledge that through the force of our own crazy minds, we created this force that is causing that to manifest in our lives right now. So we take responsibility for it. Patience means having an informed response to what's going on, knowing that the other person isn't acting completely independently. They are acting in response to our karma. Moreover, they're also acting under the influence of their own crazy minds, under their own karma. So why should we expect them to be so much better than what they currently are? Now, in a Dharma community, we have to find skillful ways to support each other in our practice, because we're always trying to, use everything as an opportunity to deepen our compassion, our patience, and so on. But nonetheless, be mindful about how you go about talking to others about, things, and not, always doing it with a patient mind, with a compassionate mind. And of course, forgiveness. I'll be doing a whole day on forgiveness in September. It's something we don't talk about in Buddhism maybe quite as much either, but I think it's important that we learn some skill around how we forgive others and what forgiveness really means. So I don't want to say too much more about that, but we all have some concept around forgiveness already. And then two more things: in communication with skillful speaking and listening. I'm going to touch on this a little bit when we go shortly into how we work with conflict. I won't have much time to spend on that, but I will be doing a session on listening. So I think that's coming up in a few weeks. So know that if you are curious about listening, we often talk about having good, skillful speaking and how to speak kindly and meaningfully and what have you. But we often don't talk about listening. But communication skills are an important part of our right action. So while I can't talk about all the various actions that might ensue from having the right attitude, it is important that we at least have good communication skills. And then, of course, inclusiveness in activities and decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person involved in the center is going to be involved in every single decision that's made around the center. Oh, should we move the altar here or there? Well, not everybody needs to be involved in that. And there are some things that really just a select number of people who have been brought forward from your community, who are in the position of the board and what have you, who need to make decisions on particular things. But when there are decisions that affect everyone in the community, I think it is important that there be an inclusive tone, trying to bring people together. If we have that compassion and that respect and cherishing others, what have you, then I think it is important that we find a way to bring others into the decision-making process. So just a few practical suggestions. We're almost out of time here today, but I think it is important that we look at this idea of conflict and community. The first thing I want to talk about, though, before we get into this, there's a book I've been reading. It's called Healing Resistance, because I got involved with this whole, in Santa Fe, we're becoming what's called a nonviolent city, nonviolent Santa Fe. There's the Nonviolent Cities Project that's nationwide, that's about creating movements within each city to address issues around violence. And this book is all about kind of overcoming nonviolence. Kazu Haga is his name. Kazu Haga talks in here about how we have this tendency to think of conflict as being negative. I'm going to read a little bit from here. He says, quick, what's the first word or image that comes to mind when you think of conflict? When I ask this question in workshops, most people say things like yelling, arguing, fighting, or violence, things with negative connotations, right? We're even calling this the conflict in Ukraine now, right? We always use conflict to refer to like wars and battles and what have you. From the perspective of nonviolence, though, we believe that all conflicts are neutral, and it is how we respond to those conflicts that results in a good or bad outcome. I really agree with this because, when there's a conflict, it simply means that you have differences in terms of how people think we should get there or what they think is the goal or how they think things should happen. And essentially, it means that you've got an opportunity to actually build community, to build harmony. We shouldn't be looking at conflict always as, oh, this is a problem for the community and we have to address it because it's going to be bad. We have to say this is absolutely the chance for us to come together and to work on strengthening the bonds that we have with others. So this is the idea behind this and what we're looking at in terms of these steps. The first step is clearly identify the problem, if there even is one. Sometimes once more, that means sitting down with somebody, communicating with them, getting clear about what it is that's going on with them. Kazu Haga in this book talks about 4 different types of conflicts where you can have, again, the same goal, but a different idea of how we get there. You can have different goals, and yet you're going to, have to confront people wanting to mutually get together and what have you. There are many different types of conflicts. We have to identify, is there really a problem here? Or is this something that is simply can be ironed out just through simply surfacing it, understanding what's going on for that particular person or persons. Secondly, being skillful in terms of the context for addressing the problem, if there is one, including time, place, people present, and so on. Okay. So again, I think this is an important part of it, is that oftentimes maybe we're not so skillful in how we actually kind of bring people together to address all of this. So again, this is making sure that we are attentive to that so that we're not like, because I have seen this and it's really uncomfortable, where like you suddenly have somebody who's in conflict with somebody else and they surface it all and try to deal with it in a larger group. And that may not be the more appropriate place for it to happen, because that might be something that the two of them need to work out and remove that sort of discord, and then the community will benefit already. But when you sort of air your dirty laundry in the midst of everyone else, it can become a bit problematic, because then you start developing sides and people say, oh no, that person's right and that person's right. And then it becomes a huge, much more huge and destructive than what it would have had it only been addressed in a very kind of small, limited community. And actually, I added on this and meant that it's already in the previous one. Be skillful in the manner of addressing the problem and giving any advice. As I said, people present in the other one. Sometimes it is very beneficial if you do have two parties that seem to be at odds to have a third party present. It's not necessarily always the case, because it depends upon, what needs to happen in terms of those particular people, their dynamic. If it's been going on for a long time, then a third person may actually be quite beneficial. But it's useful to bring someone in whose role is not to take sides, whose role is to mediate and to make sure that each side is listened to and gets an opportunity to voice what is happening. But usually if it's us and someone else that's in conflict, then we need to sit down with them, just the two of us, and work through it and really come to some agreement about that. But a third party may be valuable at times. So again, going back to that slide, be skillful in how we address the problem. Giving any advice. People are not always welcoming advice. I've found this in my own experience. We have to be careful in how we word that, how we phrase that, and present that to people. I'm just going to mention really briefly, and this is actually in that article that I quoted Geshe Sherab from, as well as Lama Zopa, that was in Mandala magazine. Additional support for challenges in centers if things cannot be handled within the confines of the people involved. This is really a last resort thing to some degree, though, is to go back to the FPMT ethical policy, which many of you know is sort of the foundation of how we are meant to interact with each other. Grievance procedures, which are really only in those rare situations where somebody has something that they really feel needs to be addressed beyond what can be handled in the center. And then there is the Foundation Service Seminar, which I think they've begun to do online to some degree, not in a formal way, but enough to be able to get the benefit of the skills that are taught in that. So I'm just going to point that out to you in that article. Again, this article, this was a little section on it that had to do with supporting harmony with FPMT. This article was called Creating Harmony Through Our Thoughts and Actions. And they had FPMT community members sharing ideas on how to create and support harmony, I guess was it. But yeah, this was the July-December 2018. They were publishing it at one point just twice a year. And so this was for the second half of 2018. So those are the main things that I wanted to cover, was to at least give you, again, hopefully an understanding of what it is within us that are these habitual reactions that become problematic, and how we can respond more effectively if we actually incorporate many of the qualities that we're being taught in Buddhism. Learning these things is one thing. Like if somebody really has learned compassion well, like they can tell you all about compassion and what's all involved and all the various meditations involved, but they've never meditated on it, they've never changed their mind, well then obviously there's a gap between the teachings and the actual integration of them in one's mind. So recognize that this is our goal as Buddhists, is to continually bring these qualities into our minds so we respond from that place. And if there are conflicts that need to be addressed, we do so in the most beneficial way. I'm just going to share a little quote from His Holiness here to end things. His Holiness says, peace starts within each one of us. When we have inner peace, we can be at peace with those around us. When our community is in a state of peace, it can share peace with neighboring communities and so on. When we feel love and kindness towards others, it not only makes others feel loved and cared for, but it helps us also to develop inner happiness and peace. So that's the idea behind all of this, of course, is that we don't just do this for the sake of the community, we are doing this also for our own sake, so that we ourselves have greater inner peace and happiness. But hopefully through our being more harmonious with others, we can make that happiness larger. We can spread that happiness so that our relationships with others also become a source of that. So any other final comments or questions? I realize we've gotten to the end of our time here. I thought I'd have a little more time for questions, but.
You should teach this in business schools. Really, it's like these are like essential leadership qualities for meaningful leadership.
Well, I have to admit that a few of the things around conflict and that I actually took from the FPMT's practical guide for skillful means, which is something they use in the foundation service seminar. And essentially, again, these are the ways that we are meant to kind of work with each other in the FPMT. But as you said, Ralph, I think every organization could benefit from these, businesses as well as other nonprofits or what have you. So. And feel free to share this information with others. I mean, and share it in your own, if you are in a workplace where you have some ability to influence others. Many of these qualities, it's not unique to Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism, even for that matter. Some of the comments obviously are working with our gurus and Refuge and things like that. But many of the other things are just good human values for us to have. I know His Holiness has been really keen on secular education, removing a lot of the religious trappings, if you will, from the core teachings that are throughout all of society. As that quote from His Holiness I had earlier, that society is kindness, society is compassion, society is caring. It is really these values that we need to bring into whatever avenue we interact with others. So, all right. No other comments, then let's just do the dedication prayers that we tend to do at the end of class. Most of you are familiar with these two. We're just going to recite them in English here, these two verses. The first one where we dedicate all this positive energy that we've created for our own benefit in becoming a Buddha, and then that we can then benefit others through attaining that state so that they too can find their greatest potential. And then in the last verse, the last 4 lines, we recall this motivation of bodhicitta that is informed by our compassion and our love and our wisdom and strives to fulfill the welfare of others. And we want that to grow and develop in our own hearts and in the hearts of others, especially our leaders in this world who need to have bodhicitta. They need to be guided by this force of wanting to benefit all beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And lastly, let's dedicate to our precious teachers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, all the teachers with whom we and others have a karmic connection. May they continue to abide in this world with good health, long lives, and may all their wishes be fulfilled. And may we and others never be parted from perfect guides in all our lives. And then lastly, we dedicate for all those beings whose situation moves us at this time. There are many that we know who are in dire situations, dealing with obstacles, illness, maybe even we know beings who have died. But there are also parts of the world and various incident situations that have happened where our hearts are moved and we think about those beings also. Whoever it is that you're thinking about, send this positive energy out to them and think that it becomes the cause to immediately remove all of their suffering. And also think that it brings them all the causes of true happiness and peace. And then we expand on that thought. May all beings find true happiness and peace, be free from all suffering through what we've done here today. Okay, thank you all so much for inviting me to talk about this topic. I found it, again, it's an interesting one to visit in the context particularly of what we've been through and everyone kind of returning to community and perhaps finding some obstacles in doing that. So I wish you all well in your practice of these teachings. Next week, I think I'm doing on acceptance of death and loss. Is that next week? I can't remember. Maybe Nicole. Yeah, she's nodding her head. Yes. So I'll look forward to that topic, a little more serious topic perhaps, but an important one as well in our day and age, as it always has been. But everyone be well, have a good week, and I'll see you then. Take care.
Thank you, Don.
Oh, you're very welcome. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.